deep in the wooded highlands of southwestern Pennsylvania, where the Appalachian Plateau folds into narrow valleys and ancient forests, thickened with time. A small stream known as Bear Run flows quietly over layers of sandstone. For centuries, its water carved shallow cascades and polished rock ledges, shaping the land with patient persistence. Long before it became a destination for architects, historians, or pilgrims of modern design, this place existed without spectacle. It was not meant to impress. It carried no ambition, no legacy, no desire to be remembered. And yet, it would become the foundation for one of the most celebrated architectural works of the 20th century. The house would be called Fallingwater. When Fallingwater was completed in 1937, it was far more than a weekend retreat. It stood as a physical manifesto, an audacious challenge to convention, gravity, and time itself. It was also a deeply personal statement, created at a moment when its architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, was widely believed to be past his prime. At 69 years old, Wright was no longer the rising revolutionary of American architecture. The Great Depression had dried up commissions. Critics had begun to speak of him in the past tense, and many assumed his most important contributions were already behind him. Fallingwater would prove otherwise. The commission came from Edgar J. Kaufman, the wealthy heir to Kaufman's department store in Pittsburgh. Kaufman was not merely a patron with financial means. He was intellectually curious, deeply interested in modern art and architecture, and searching for something more than a conventional country home. Bear Run had long served as a place of escape for his family, a refuge from the industrial city and the pressures of commerce. He envisioned a house that would allow him to enjoy the landscape, a residence position near the waterfall, offering comfort, privacy, and scenic beauty. Wright's response would overturn that expectation completely. Rather than designing a house that looked at the waterfall, Wright proposed a house that would live within it. Instead of placing the structure at a respectful distance, he anchored it directly above the rushing water, allowing the sound of the stream to permeate every level. It was not a decorative decision, nor a clever architectural trick. It was a philosophical statement. Wright believed that buildings should not dominate nature, but participate in it. Architecture, in his view, was strongest when it dissolved the boundary between the natural and the human-made. At Fallingwater, that belief took physical form through a series of bold, horizontal concrete terraces that projected outward like geological strata, echoing the rock ledges beneath them. The house did not rise above the landscape. It extended from it. Stone quarried from the site itself was integrated into the walls, while glass dissolved traditional notions of enclosure. Nature was not framed as a distant view. It was allowed inside. The proposal, however, alarmed nearly everyone who examined it closely. The dramatic cantilevers appeared to defy structural logic. Engineers questioned the amount of steel reinforcement. Builders worried about deflection, stress, and long-term stability. Even Kaufman, captivated as he was by Wright's vision, quietly sought independent engineering advice. The concern was not aesthetic. It was existential. Could a structure this daring survive its own ambition? Wright was unmoved by doubt. He trusted intuition as much as calculation, believing that true architectural innovation required risk. To him, safety margins were often the enemy of beauty. Fallingwater was designed not to compromise, but to challenge, and that challenge extended beyond the moment of construction. As work progressed during the depths of the Depression, tension grew between artistic vision and engineering reality. Adjustments were debated. Reinforcement was added, sometimes without Wright's full consent. Even before the house was complete, subtle signs of strain appeared. Yet when Fallingwater was finished, and the Kaufman family took residence, the impact was immediate and profound. Photographs of the house circulated rapidly, through architectural journals and popular magazines. Critics hailed it as revolutionary. It did not resemble European palaces or American mansions. It rejected symmetry, ornament, and historical imitation. Instead, it offered something radically modern, deeply American, and inseparable from its environment. Fallingwater was celebrated not just as a house, but as an idea made concrete. But within that triumph lay an unspoken truth. Fallingwater was designed to coexist with nature, yet nature is relentless. Water seeps. Moisture expands. Freeze and thaw cycles exert pressure without mercy. The same stream that gave the house its identity would also become its greatest adversary. From its earliest years, Fallingwater began to ask a question that would haunt it for generations. Can a masterpiece built at the edge of possibility endure without constant sacrifice? Or does preserving architectural greatness inevitably demand a price far greater than anyone first imagined? The answer would not arrive quickly. It would unfold over decades, through cracks, reinforcements, debates, and interventions, each one forcing a reckoning between fidelity to Wright's vision and the brutal physics of the real world. And so, even as Fallingwater entered history, as a symbol of harmony between architecture and nature, it quietly began a second life, not as a completed work, but as an ongoing struggle to keep a dream from collapsing into the water below. In the years immediately following its completion, Fallingwater appeared to fulfill every promise Frank Lloyd Wright had made. The sound of Bear Run echoed softly through open windows. Morning light slid across concrete terraces and stone floors. The house did not feel imposed upon the land. It felt born from it. To visitors, it was a revelation. To its owners, it was an escape unlike any other. And to the architectural world, it was proof that Wright had not only returned, but surpassed his earlier achievements. Yet beneath this apparent harmony, the building was already beginning to speak, in a quieter language, one of stress, movement, and resistance. Concrete, despite its strength, is not static. It responds to gravity, moisture, temperature, and time. At Fallingwater, the long horizontal cantilevers that gave the house its iconic form were also its most vulnerable elements. Almost immediately, subtle deflections were noticed. Floors that were meant to appear perfectly level showed minute changes. Doors shifted slightly within their frames. These were not dramatic failures, but they were not imagined either. The cantilevers were bending. This reality did not come as a complete surprise to those who had studied the drawings closely. During construction, several engineers had raised concerns about the amount of steel reinforcement embedded within the concrete. Wright had insisted that it was sufficient. Others disagreed. Quietly, without the architect's full knowledge. Additional reinforcement had been added at the request of Edgar J. Kaufman. It was a decision born not of defiance, but of unease, a recognition that beauty alone could not negotiate with gravity. Even so, the deflection continued. Wright, when informed, responded with characteristic confidence. Buildings, he argued, were living things. Movement was not inherently a flaw. A small amount of sagging did not threaten the integrity of the design. To him, concern over structural purity often masked a deeper fear of innovation. He had always believed that excessive caution led to architectural mediocrity. But for the Kaufman family, Fallingwater was not a theoretical exercise. It was a home. And over time, the signs became harder to ignore. Cracks appeared in the concrete. Water infiltration became a recurring problem, particularly during harsh Pennsylvania winters. Moisture seeped through joints where terraces met walls, slowly corroding the steel hidden within. Freeze and thaw cycles expanded tiny fissures into persistent weaknesses. Each repair addressed a symptom, not the underlying condition. The house required attention, constant, expensive, and increasingly specialized. By the 1950s, Fallingwater was no longer simply admired, it was being watched. Architects, engineers, and historians recognize that this masterpiece existed in a precarious balance. The very elements that made it revolutionary also made it fragile. Wright's insistence on pushing materials to their limits had produced a work of genius, but it had also transferred an unseen burden to those who would inherit it. That burden grew heavier after Wright's death in 1959. Without its creator to interpret intent or authorize adaptation, Fallingwater entered a new phase of existence. The house was no longer evolving under the guidance of its architect. It was aging. And aging, for a structure so intimately bound to water and climate, was unforgiving. The Kaufman family faced a decision that countless owners of historic works eventually confront, whether to treat the building as a private possession or as a public responsibility. Maintaining Fallingwater demanded resources beyond routine upkeep. Every intervention risked altering Wright's vision. Every hesitation risked irreversible damage. In 1963, the family chose preservation over privacy. Fallingwater was entrusted to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, transforming the house into a public site dedicated to education, conservation, and architectural heritage. This decision ensured its survival, but it also marked the beginning of a new struggle, one fought not with creativity, but with engineering reports, funding campaigns, and ethical dilemmas. Preservation introduced a paradox. To keep Fallingwater as Wright intended, it would need to be changed. Steel would have to be added. Concrete would have to be reinforced. Water would need to be redirected. None of these measures existed in the original design. Yet without them, the structure risked slow collapse. As the decades passed, measurements confirmed what had long been suspected. The main cantilever had deflected several inches beyond acceptable limits. Structural engineers warned that without major intervention, failure was not a matter of speculation, but of time. The question was no longer whether Fallingwater would change, but how and at what cost. In this moment, Fallingwater ceased to be only a symbol of architectural harmony. It became a case study in consequence, a reminder that even the most brilliant ideas must ultimately answer to physics, and that preserving genius often demands sacrifices that its creator never intended to make. The dream built on moving water was still standing, but it was bending, and the effort to hold it in place was about to enter its most critical chapter. By the late 20th century, the evidence could no longer be softened by language or deferred through minor repairs. Measurements taken over decades confirmed a slow but persistent truth. The primary cantilever of Fallingwater was continuing to sag. What had once been measured in fractions of an inch had grown into several inches of deflection. Engineers warned that the reinforced concrete, already stressed beyond its original assumptions, was approaching a threshold where recovery would no longer be possible. The house was not failing dramatically. It was failing quietly. This silence made the danger more difficult to confront. Fallingwater remained visually breathtaking. Visitors still stood in awe of its terraces, hovering above Bear Run. Yet beneath their feet, steel reinforcement embedded in concrete was corroding, weakened by decades of moisture infiltration. The very proximity to water that defined the house's identity was now threatening its survival. For the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, which had assumed stewardship of the property, the situation demanded an unprecedented decision. Preservation was no longer a philosophical discussion. It was a technical emergency. To do nothing would be to risk collapse. To intervene too aggressively would be to compromise the integrity of Frank Lloyd Wright's vision. The dilemma was stark. How does one preserve a masterpiece whose original design resists preservation? In the 1990s, a comprehensive structural analysis was commissioned. Advanced modeling techniques, unavailable during Wright's lifetime, revealed the extent of internal stress within the cantilevers. The conclusions were sobering. Without substantial reinforcement, failure was not hypothetical. It was inevitable. The house had reached a moment where idealism had to yield to physics. The solution proposed was radical by preservation standards. Post-tensioning cables would be installed within the existing concrete structure, effectively pulling the cantilevers back toward their original position and redistributing the load. This technique, common in modern engineering, had never been part of Wright's vocabulary for Fallingwater. Implementing it would require invasive work, careful excavation, and an acceptance that the building could no longer remain exactly as it had been conceived. The debate that followed was intense. Purists argued that altering the structure violated Wright's intent. Fallingwater, they claimed, was meant to exist on the edge of possibility. To stabilize it beyond that edge was to rewrite history. Others countered that Wright himself had been pragmatic when necessary, and that allowing the house to deteriorate in the name of authenticity was not preservation but neglect. Ultimately, survival outweighed ideology. The intervention began at the turn of the 21st century, carried out with meticulous precision. Floors were temporarily removed. Walls were carefully opened. Steel cables were threaded through the heart of the structure and tensioned incrementally, millimeter by millimeter, under constant monitoring. The process was slow, deliberate, and extraordinarily expensive. But gradually, the cantilever responded. Deflection was reduced. Structural integrity was restored. For the first time in decades, Fallingwater was no longer bending under its own ambition. Yet the success of the intervention raised uncomfortable questions. The house that emerged from stabilization was stronger than the one Wright had built. It was safer, more resilient, and undeniably different. Though invisible to most visitors, the internal anatomy of the building had been fundamentally altered. Preservation had saved the form, but transformed the substance. This paradox lies at the heart of Fallingwater's legacy. It stands today, not only as a triumph of architectural imagination, but as a testament to the costs incurred when imagination outruns material limits. Every generation that inherits the house inherits a responsibility not just to admire it, but to sustain it through continual care, monitoring, and financial commitment. The price of preservation did not end with stabilization. Water management systems were upgraded. Environmental controls were installed to regulate humidity. Maintenance became a permanent operation rather than an occasional task. Fallingwater was no longer simply a house to be visited. It was a living system requiring constant attention. And yet, despite these interventions, or perhaps because of them, Fallingwater endured. It remains suspended above moving water, its terraces extending defiantly into space, its presence inseparable from the landscape that both inspired and endangered it. What visitors see today is not merely a relic of the past, but the result of ongoing negotiation between history and science, between reverence and responsibility. The question now is no longer whether Fallingwater can be preserved, but what its preservation teaches us. About architecture, about ambition, and about the unseen labor required to keep greatness from collapsing under the weight of its own vision. With its structural crisis stabilized, Fallingwater entered a new chapter of existence. One defined not by creation, but by stewardship. The house no longer belonged to a single family, nor even to a single nation's architectural history. It had become a global reference point, studied in classrooms, debated in conservation journals, and visited by hundreds of thousands each year. Its survival was no longer a private concern. It was a public responsibility. As the 20th century drew to a close, Fallingwater's status as an architectural icon was firmly established. Scholars increasingly described it not merely as Frank Lloyd Wright's most famous house, but as one of the most important buildings ever constructed in the United States. In 2019, this recognition was formalized when Fallingwater became part of a group of rights works inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, a designation that placed it alongside humanity's most treasured cultural sites. Yet this honor brought with it a deeper tension. World Heritage status implies endurance. It suggests permanence, continuity, and responsibility across generations. But Fallingwater, by its very nature, resists the idea of permanence. It was designed as a living experiment, one deeply entangled with water, weather, and change. Unlike ancient stone monuments, it cannot simply be left to stand. Its materials demand vigilance. Its environment demands adaptation. This contradiction lies at the heart of modern architectural preservation. Unlike classical or medieval structures, modernist buildings often rely on materials that age poorly. Reinforced concrete, steel, expansive glass, and experimental construction techniques. Frank Lloyd Wright embraced these materials, not because they were proven, but because they allowed him to push beyond the constraints of tradition. Fallingwater embodies that ambition. But ambition, once realized, becomes inheritance, and inheritance carries obligations. Preserving Fallingwater has therefore become an ongoing ethical negotiation. Each intervention raises fundamental questions. How much change is acceptable in the name of survival? At what point does preservation become transformation? Is authenticity defined by original materials or by original intent? There are no simple answers. To maintain Fallingwater today requires constant monitoring of structural movement, moisture levels, and environmental conditions. Conservation teams analyze data continuously, not unlike physicians tracking a patient with a chronic condition. Maintenance is proactive rather than reactive. Problems are addressed before they become visible. What visitors experience as effortless beauty is, in reality, sustained through relentless effort, and the cost is substantial. Millions of dollars have been invested over decades to ensure that Fallingwater remains standing. These funds support engineering assessments, specialized conservation labor, environmental systems, and ongoing research. The house generates revenue through tourism, but that revenue is largely reinvested into its own survival. Fallingwater does not simply exist. It must be actively protected. This reality reframes the narrative of genius. Fallingwater is often celebrated as a triumph of individual vision, the product of a single extraordinary mind. But its continued existence reveals a different truth. Great architecture is rarely sustained by genius alone. It endures through institutions, expertise, and collective commitment long after the architect is gone. In this sense, Fallingwater is no longer only Frank Lloyd Wright's creation. It is the result of decades of collaboration between conservators, engineers, historians, and the public. Its identity has expanded beyond authorship into stewardship. And still, the house remains precarious. Climate change introduces new uncertainties. Increased rainfall, temperature fluctuations, and extreme weather events intensify the environmental pressures that have always threatened the structure. What was once a manageable challenge now demands adaptive strategies that Wright could never have anticipated. Preservation, once focused on repair, now must consider resilience. This evolving reality forces a final, unavoidable question: should every masterpiece be preserved indefinitely? Fallingwater suggests that preservation is not a neutral act. It is a choice, one that prioritizes cultural memory over material simplicity and collective heritage over natural decay. To preserve Fallingwater is to accept ongoing intervention as a moral obligation. To allow it to fail would be to accept loss as part of history's natural cycle. Neither path is without consequence. Standing above Bear Run today, Fallingwater appears serene, suspended between forest and water, as it always has been. But beneath that calm surface lies a truth often overlooked. The house is not frozen in time. It is held there deliberately, carefully, and at great cost. And perhaps that is Fallingwater's most enduring lesson. That the greatest works of human imagination do not survive by inspiration alone. They survive because generation after generation chooses to hold them in place, even when doing so means quietly rewriting the conditions of their existence. More than 8 decades after its completion, Fallingwater remains one of the most recognizable works of architecture in the world. Its image is instantly familiar: concrete, planes reaching outward over moving water, stone rising organically from the earth, glass dissolving the boundary between shelter and landscape. It appears timeless, almost inevitable, as though it could not exist in any other form, or in any other place. But time has revealed that inevitability was an illusion. Fallingwater survives not because it was immune to decay, but because it has been relentlessly defended against it. The house endures today through constant human intervention, through engineering, funding, scholarship, and vigilance. What appears effortless is, in truth, sustained by continuous effort. What seems eternal is carefully managed. This reality invites a deeper reassessment of Frank Lloyd Wright and the legacy he left behind. Wright is often celebrated as a visionary who reshaped modern architecture, and rightly so. His ideas about organic architecture, spatial continuity, and the integration of building and landscape changed how architects think about space. Fallingwater stands as the most complete and powerful expression of those ideas. It is not merely a house. It is an argument made of stone, steel, and concrete. Yet it is also a cautionary tale. Wright believed that architecture should push beyond accepted limits. He distrusted conservatism, resisted compromise, and embraced risk as a necessary condition of greatness. At Fallingwater, that philosophy reached its most dramatic form. The house achieved beauty precisely because it flirted with failure. But in doing so, it transferred responsibility forward in time. The risks Wright accepted on paper became burdens borne by future generations. This transfer is rarely acknowledged when genius is celebrated. To preserve Fallingwater has required decisions Wright himself never faced. Engineers have strengthened what he made fragile. Conservators have altered what he intended to remain pure. Environmental systems now regulate a structure that was designed to breathe freely with nature. Each change has been justified in the name of survival. Yet each moves the house further from its original condition. And still, without these changes, the house would not stand. This tension exposes a central paradox of modern preservation. If a building is saved only by becoming something its creator never imagined, what exactly is being preserved? Is it the material object, the visual form, the philosophical intent, or the cultural meaning that society has attached to it over time? Fallingwater suggests that preservation is not about freezing the past. It is about negotiation, a continuous balancing act between fidelity and adaptation. The house that exists today is neither entirely Wright's nor entirely contemporary. It is a hybrid, shaped as much by conservation science as by architectural vision. In this sense, Fallingwater has become more than a masterpiece of design. It is a mirror reflecting how societies choose to value creativity, risk, and memory. To preserve it is to assert that human imagination is worth protecting, even when doing so demands resources, intervention, and humility. But it also forces an uncomfortable recognition. Some works of genius may be unsustainable by nature. They may demand more care than any single generation can reasonably provide. Preserving them indefinitely may not always be an act of respect, but an act of defiance against time itself. Standing above Bear Run, with water still flowing beneath its cantilevers, Fallingwater appears calm, balanced, resolved. Yet its true story is not one of permanence, but of perseverance. It survives because people continue to choose it, to study it, to fund it, to repair it, and to believe that its presence matters. Perhaps that is its final legacy. Not that architecture can conquer nature, but that it can inspire commitment across generations. Not that genius is flawless, but that it is worth the effort to sustain. Fallingwater endures not because it is immortal, but because it is cared for. And in that care lies the final cost and the final meaning of preserving a masterpiece. In the broader history of architecture, Fallingwater occupies a rare and difficult position. It is neither a ruin preserved for its romance, nor a monument stabilized into lifeless permanence. Instead, it exists in a state of continual, becoming a structure that teaches not through perfection, but through vulnerability. Few buildings have forced such sustained introspection about what it truly means to preserve human creativity. When Frank Lloyd Wright imagined Fallingwater, he was not designing for eternity in the traditional sense. He rejected the monumental language of permanence. He believed architecture should live, breathe, and change alongside the people who inhabited it. Yet he also assumed a future that would honor his vision, without fully accounting for the cost of doing so. In this way, Fallingwater exposes a tension at the heart of modernism itself. A movement driven by optimism, experimentation, and belief in progress, often at the expense of long-term consequence. As architectural education evolved in the latter half of the 20th century, Fallingwater became more than a case study in design. It became a case study in responsibility. Students were no longer taught only how Wright composed space and structure, but how his decisions reverberated decades later. The house entered engineering textbooks, conservation symposia, and ethical debates about intervention. It quietly shifted the profession's understanding of legacy. In preserving Fallingwater, institutions learned that modern architecture demands a different kind of care than the architecture of the past. Stone cathedrals weather slowly. Timber houses decay predictably. But reinforced concrete, the very symbol of modern confidence, ages in complex and often unforgiving ways. Fallingwater revealed that innovation does not free architecture from maintenance. It multiplies it. This realization has influenced how other modern landmarks are treated across the world. From mid-century civic buildings to experimental houses perched on cliffs or coastlines, preservation strategies now incorporate lessons first made unavoidable at Fallingwater. Continuous monitoring, interdisciplinary collaboration, and acceptance of discrete alteration have become standard practices. In this sense, Fallingwater's struggles have helped protect buildings far beyond its own forested site. Yet there remains something uniquely personal about this house. Unlike urban landmarks, Fallingwater does not dominate a skyline. It hides within trees. It reveals itself slowly, through sound before sight. Visitors do not approach it as conquerors of space, but as guests entering a fragile equilibrium. The house asks for attentiveness. It demands silence. It encourages humility. That experience shapes how it is remembered. To stand on its terraces is to feel suspended not only over water, but between eras. One foot rests in the boundless confidence of early modernism. The other stands in a present defined by caution, climate uncertainty, and ethical restraint. Fallingwater bridges these worlds without resolving their conflict. And perhaps that unresolved tension is its greatest contribution. Fallingwater teaches that great architecture is not finished when construction ends. It continues to ask questions long after its creator is gone. It asks who will care for it, at what cost, and for how long. It challenges the assumption that cultural value alone guarantees survival. Instead, it insists that survival is an active choice, renewed again and again by each generation. As water continues to flow beneath its cantilevers, unchanged in rhythm but altered by time, Fallingwater remains not as a triumph over nature, but as a dialogue with it. A dialogue sustained through effort, compromise, and devotion. The house does not promise permanence. It offers something rarer, a lesson in care. Long before most people ever set foot inside it, Fallingwater had already entered their imagination. Its image traveled farther than its walls could ever reach. Through photographs, books, exhibitions, and film, the house escaped its forested setting and became an idea, a symbol that could be carried, reproduced, and reinterpreted across generations. Photography played a decisive role in this transformation. Early images published in architectural magazines framed Fallingwater as a miracle of balance and daring. Carefully composed angles emphasized hovering terraces, dramatic shadows, and the illusion of effortless suspension. These photographs did more than document the house. They constructed its myth. They distilled a complex, fragile structure into a single, unforgettable image of harmony between humanity and nature. In these images, the labor of maintenance was invisible. The cracks were cropped out. The sagging cantilevers were concealed by perspective. What the world saw was not the house as it aged, but the house as it aspired to be. Cinema followed. Fallingwater began to appear in documentaries, television programs, and cultural retrospectives as shorthand for architectural brilliance. Filmmakers lingered on slow-tracking shots across stone walls and concrete plains, letting the sound of bare run replace narration. The house became cinematic, not because it was designed for film, but because it embodied a mood contemplative, modern, intimate, and quietly radical. In this mediated form, Fallingwater ceased to be a private residence, or even a physical site. It became part of collective memory. For many, it came to represent an idealized moment in American history, a time when creativity seemed limitless, when innovation promised harmony rather than disruption. In classrooms and museums, Fallingwater was taught as proof that modernity could be humane, that progress need not erase nature, but could coexist with it. Yet collective memory is selective. Rarely did popular narratives dwell on the house's fragility. Rarely did they acknowledge that Fallingwater's continued existence depended on decades of unseen effort. The myth favored vision over vigilance, inspiration over responsibility. In this way, Fallingwater became emblematic of a broader cultural tendency to celebrate creation while overlooking preservation. This tension is especially evident in how Fallingwater functions as a pilgrimage site. Visitors arrive with expectations shaped by images they have seen for years. Many speak in hushed tones, as if entering a sacred space. The experience is often emotional, even transformative. But few consider the invisible systems that make that experience possible: the engineers who monitor deflection, the conservators who manage moisture, the staff who enforce limits on foot traffic to protect the structure. What visitors encounter feels timeless. What sustains it is intensely contemporary. Over time, Fallingwater's image has been repurposed beyond architecture. It appears in advertising, fashion photography, album covers, and digital media, often detached from its historical context. In these adaptations, the house functions as a visual metaphor for balance, luxury, intellect, or ecological awareness. Each use adds another layer to its cultural identity, while further distancing it from the realities of its upkeep. This process raises an unsettling question. Does widespread recognition help preserve a masterpiece, or does it risk hollowing out its meaning? For Fallingwater, fame has been both shield and burden. Global recognition has generated funding, attention, and institutional support. But it has also fixed the house in an idealized past, making necessary change harder to accept. Every intervention risks public backlash. Every visible alteration threatens the image people believe they know. Thus, Fallingwater exists in two parallel forms. One is physical, complex, and continuously negotiated. The other is symbolic, clean, resolved, and frozen in memory. The gap between these two realities continues to widen. As digital culture accelerates, images circulate faster than understanding. Fallingwater is consumed in seconds on screens, stripped of scale, sound, and context. The house becomes content rather than place. In this transformation, its most important lesson, the cost of care, is easily lost. And yet, memory can also be a form of preservation. The persistence of Fallingwater in cultural consciousness ensures that it is not forgotten, not abandoned, not dismissed as obsolete. Its image keeps returning, asking to be reconsidered. Even in simplified form, it continues to provoke curiosity, admiration, and debate. Perhaps this is the final contradiction Fallingwater embodies. It survives physically through constant intervention, and culturally through repeated reinterpretation. It is held together by steel cables and by stories, by engineering calculations and by imagination. In both cases, survival depends not on stasis, but on renewal. Fallingwater endures because it is remembered, and because that memory, however imperfect, continues to inspire the effort required to keep the house standing above the water that never stops moving. In the end, Fallingwater does not ask to be admired. It asks to be considered. It stands as it always has, suspended above moving water, neither triumphant nor defeated. The forest around it continues to grow and recede with the seasons. The stream beneath it never pauses, never acknowledges the structure hovering above its path. Time flows past the house without ceremony, indifferent to reputation or legacy. What keeps Fallingwater in place is not inevitability, but choice. Every generation that encounters the house faces the same quiet decision, whether this work still matters enough to be held, whether its ideas remain worth the effort required to sustain them, whether the vision of one architect, born in a moment of optimism and risk, should continue to shape the present. This is the final cost of preservation. Not money alone, though the expense is substantial. Not labor alone, though the work is constant. The true cost lies in responsibility, in accepting that greatness, once created, does not absolve itself. It must be carried forward by those who inherit it, often in ways the creator never imagined. Frank Lloyd Wright believed architecture could bring humanity closer to nature. At Fallingwater, he achieved that vision with extraordinary power. But he also revealed its fragility. The house teaches that harmony is not static, it must be maintained. Balance, once achieved, does not hold itself. Preserving Fallingwater has required compromise, humility, and restraint. It has required acknowledging that reverence for genius cannot replace engineering, and that authenticity is not always found in original materials, but in continued meaning. The house that exists today is not frozen in 1937. It is alive, altered, supported, watched, and cared for. And that may be its most honest form. Fallingwater endures not as proof that architecture can conquer nature, but as evidence that human beings can choose to care for what they value, even when doing so is difficult. It reminds us that cultural inheritance is not passive. It is an ongoing act. As the final light fades across its terraces, and the sound of water rises once more, Fallingwater remains, not because it was destined to last forever, but because it has been held there, deliberately, by countless unseen hands. In that choice lies its legacy, not permanence, but perseverance, not immortality, but care.